One unexpected moment, one tearful child, one secret that changes everything. When Blair Burlington, ruthless CEO of Burlington Enterprises, soothes a crying toddler mid-flight, he feels an unfamiliar pull, an instinct he'd never known he had. But nothing prepares him for the truth. The boy is his son, and the woman he left behind never truly left his heart. Morgan Brown has built a quiet, resilient life for herself and her son, far from the glittering chaos of Blair's world. Now, facing the man who once shattered her trust, she must decide if she's willing to risk everything again, for herself, for her son, and for a love she thought was lost forever. In a story woven with heartbreak, healing, and hope, reminds us that the most powerful empires are built not on wealth, but on second chances, and that sometimes the love you feared losing is the one that was meant to last. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I love hearing from you. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt romance, one life at a time. Blair Burlington adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket for the third time, feeling a restless impatience churn in his chest. 30,000 feet above the ground, trapped in first-class luxury, and yet somehow more uncomfortable than he'd been during board meetings that decided the fate of billion-dollar mergers. He hated flying commercial. But at the last minute, his private jet had been grounded for maintenance, a rare misstep in a life calibrated to perfection. So here he was, wedged into seat 2A, pretending he didn't notice the toddler 2 rows ahead wailing like the world was ending. Blair exhaled sharply, dragging a hand over his face. He was a CEO, not a babysitter. Emotional outbursts made him uneasy. Inefficient, unfixable things he'd learned to outmaneuver in boardrooms and more ruthlessly in his personal life. But then, something shifted. A small hiccuping sob caught his ear, frailer than before, threaded with exhaustion. Blair's gaze flicked over the seats and landed on the boy. Blonde hair tousled, tiny hands rubbing red-rimmed eyes, lower lip trembling. The woman next to him, likely the mother, was struggling to calm him, her own features pinched with fatigue and helplessness. Something stirred in Blair's chest, a flicker he couldn't immediately stamp out. Without thinking, he rose, ignoring the curious glances from other passengers, and made his way down the aisle. He crouched beside the row, voice low and surprisingly gentle. "Hey, buddy? Rough flight?" The boy blinked up at him, stunned into silence. Tears clung to his lashes. For a moment, it felt like time folded inward, a strange familiarity tightening around Blair's ribs. The mother turned, and Blair's world tilted on its axis. Morgan Brown. The name crashed into his mind seconds before recognition flashed in her wide brown eyes. Years peeled away like paper, his ambition, his decisions, the silent goodbye neither had dared to voice. "Blair," Morgan breathed, color draining from her face. He stared at her, utterly disoriented. "Morgan." His voice was a rasp, almost drowned by the thrum of the engines. The toddler, their son, sniffled once, then reached out a chubby hand and gripped the sleeve of Blair's jacket. Blair looked down at the boy. He couldn't seem to move. He couldn't seem to breathe. The resemblance, now that he saw it, was like a gut punch. The boy had Morgan's warm brown eyes, but there was no mistaking the shape of the jaw, the stubborn tilt of the chin. His chin. Blair straightened slowly, his mind a slow roar of disbelief and calculations he couldn't untangle. This wasn't just turbulence in the skies. This was turbulence in the very structure of his life. Morgan looked as if she wanted to vanish. "We can talk after we land," she said in a whisper meant only for him, her hand wrapping protectively around the boy's shoulders. Blair nodded, once, curtly, because the alternative was reaching across the aisle and demanding answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. He returned to his seat without looking back, every nerve ending burning. He stared out the window, the skyline of the city he ruled growing larger as they descended. And for the first time in years, Blair Burlington, the man who controlled everything, felt utterly powerless. Blair stood stiffly at the baggage claim carousel, the polished floors beneath his shoes reflecting a version of himself he barely recognized. His carry-on rested at his feet, untouched. For once, he wasn't calculating the next deal, the next acquisition. He was waiting. Morgan appeared across the terminal, Connor perched on her hip, his small arms looped loosely around her neck. She moved toward him with a hesitation that sliced through Blair more cleanly than any argument ever could. He straightened his cuffs, more from habit than purpose, and met her gaze head-on when she finally stopped a few feet away. "We should talk," she said, voice quiet but steady. Connor shifted, resting his cheek against her shoulder. "Yeah," Blair managed. "We should." Morgan glanced around and spotted a quieter alcove near the oversized luggage counter. She walked ahead, and Blair followed, tension tightening between his shoulder blades with every step. When they reached the corner, she set Connor down carefully. The boy clung to the side of her jeans, peeking shyly up at Blair. Morgan knelt to adjust Connor's jacket, buying herself time. When she rose, she met Blair's stare, her face composed but pale. "I didn't plan for this," she said, "running into you. I didn't even know you were on that flight." Blair let out a short breath. "I didn't know you were in New York at all." Morgan's arms crossed over her chest, a defensive shield he recognized from years ago. "We moved here 2 months ago. New job offer. Fresh start." He nodded tightly, filing that information away even as more urgent questions burned at the tip of his tongue. "And him?" he asked, voice low, tipping his chin toward Connor. "Morgan? He's mine, isn't he?" The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Morgan swallowed hard. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, offer some escape hatch for both of them. But then she squared her shoulders. "Yes," she whispered. "Connor is your son." Blair closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the impact. A son. 3 years of missed birthdays, first words, scraped knees, moments he could never get back. He opened his eyes and found Morgan studying him, wary. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was rougher than he intended. Morgan flinched. "You were building an empire, Blair. You made it clear where your priorities were. I didn't want Connor to ever feel like he was second place to your ambition." He rocked back slightly, stung by the truth of it. "That wasn't your choice to make," he said, each word deliberate. Morgan's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Maybe not, but it was the only choice I had back then." Connor tugged on Morgan's jacket, mumbling something incoherent, and she bent to scoop him into her arms again. The motion was automatic, seamless, the kind of natural parenting Blair had no idea how to mimic yet. He cleared his throat, struggling to find his footing on this new ground. "I want to be part of his life," he said finally. "I don't know how yet, but I need to try." Morgan's gaze softened almost imperceptibly, but her stance stayed guarded. "We'll talk," she said, "but not here. Not today." Blair nodded stiffly, sensing the end of the conversation. "Can I walk you out?" A small hesitation, then a reluctant nod. "All right." They moved together toward the exit, an awkward, unbalanced trio, each step forward heavier than the last. Blair had built empires from nothing, but rebuilding trust, reclaiming time lost with a son he never knew existed, that would be the greatest challenge of his life. And for once, he was terrified he might not be enough. The car's engine hummed softly as Blair guided the sleek black SUV onto the expressway, heading toward the city. In the passenger seat, Morgan sat stiffly, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Connor was tucked safely in the back, strapped into a borrowed booster seat the airline staff had offered at the last minute. He was quiet now, staring out the window, small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the glass. Blair kept his focus on the road, but he was hyper-aware of everything. The faint scent of Morgan's perfume, the way her knee jiggled slightly as if she were counting the seconds until she could leave. The silence between them wasn't companionable. It was weighted, brittle, 1,000 unsaid words clogging the space like fog. He flexed his grip on the steering wheel. "You could have called," he said eventually, his voice low but not angry. Morgan's gaze stayed fixed out her window. "I almost did," she admitted. "A few times." "Why didn't you?" A pause, a breath. "I didn't think you'd want the complication." Blair's jaw clenched. "You thought I wouldn't want my son?" Morgan turned to him then, her eyes flashing. "I thought you wouldn't know how to want him." The words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Because once, she would have been right. Once, ambition had eclipsed everything else. Promotions, expansions, dominance in every market he entered. He'd had no room for love, no patience for vulnerability. But now? Now the idea of not knowing Connor, of missing another day, was unbearable in a way he hadn't even had time to fully process. "You don't know who I am anymore," Blair said, not taking his eyes off the road. "Maybe," Morgan allowed, "but you don't know him either." The truth of that stung worst of all. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Connor caught his eyes for a fleeting second, then shyly turned away, burying his face in a stuffed bear he carried. The child didn't trust him. Why should he? Blair swallowed the tight knot rising in his throat. I want to, he said roughly. I want to know him, and you. Morgan didn't respond. Not immediately. The skyline loomed closer, a sharp contrast of glittering glass and steel against the setting sun. Normally, Blair felt a surge of pride seeing the city, his playground, his conquest. Today, it just looked like another mountain he had to climb, and this time he didn't have a map. When he pulled up to Morgan's apartment building, a modest brownstone on the edge of a family-friendly neighborhood, he put the SUV in park but made no move to unbuckle. Morgan did, twisting in her seat to unfasten Connor. She moved automatically, her hands sure, steady. Watching her, Blair felt a deep, aching realization. She hadn't just survived without him. She had built something, a life, a family, without him. Connor tumbled out of the seat and latched onto Morgan's hand. His small presence seemed to form a protective shield around her, one Blair didn't dare cross. Morgan turned back to him once more. I'm not saying no, she said quietly. I'm saying this has to be slow, for his sake, for mine. Blair nodded, swallowing the surge of urgency that wanted to argue, to demand more. Slow, he echoed. She hesitated. I'll call you. Once we're settled. She didn't offer more than that, and Blair knew better than to push. He watched her walk away, take Connor's little hand wrapped tightly around hers, their figures shrinking as they climbed the steps to the building. Blair sat alone in the car long after the door shut behind them, the city pulsing around him. He had lost them once. He wouldn't lose them again, no matter how long it took. Morgan stood at her small kitchen counter, staring blankly at the chipped ceramic mug in her hands. The apartment around her was still half-boxed from their recent move, but it already felt more like home than anywhere else she'd lived in years. Connor was tucked into bed, worn out from the flight and the long day. The stuffed bear he clutched while sleeping had been a gift from Morgan, a small comfort in a world that kept changing faster than she could prepare him for. The knock on her door came softly, almost hesitantly. Morgan froze for a heartbeat. She knew it would be him. She had called, after all, against her better judgment, against every wall she'd carefully built. Crossing the room, she opened the door. Blair stood there, a figure carved out of the evening shadows, his broad shoulders taut, his expression wary. Gone was the polished CEO mask he wore so easily. In its place was something rawer, uncertain. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey." His voice was just as low, just as careful. She stepped aside to let him in, and he entered, scanning the modest space with a glance that seemed to take in every unpacked box, every photo she hadn't yet hung. Morgan motioned toward the small dining table. "Sit if you want." He obeyed without comment, and for a few long seconds they simply sat across from each other, a gulf of unspoken words between them. Finally, Morgan broke the silence. "You deserve answers," she said. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug. Not guesses, not assumptions. Blair's hands were braced on his knees, his entire frame coiled like he was bracing for impact. "I'm listening." She swallowed hard. "I found out I was pregnant a month after you left for London." Her voice was steady, but the memories clawed at her. "You were already different then. You barely answered my calls. You were chasing something bigger than both of us." Blair flinched, a slight, involuntary movement. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to be another burden," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I wanted to believe I could do it on my own, that Connor would never have to wonder if he was second best to boardrooms and conference calls." Blair's mouth opened, then closed again, as if the right words were just beyond his reach. "You should have told me anyway," he said finally, voice rough. "I know." Morgan closed her eyes briefly. "But I was scared. I didn't want to watch you choose something else over him." Blair exhaled a long, ragged breath. "I wouldn't have. You don't know that," Morgan said softly. "And I didn't want to gamble with his heart." Silence fell again, thicker this time. Outside, the muted hum of the city pulsed like a distant heartbeat. Blair leaned forward, elbows braced on the table. "I can't change the past, Morgan. I can't get back the years I missed." His voice was low, heavy with something that sounded suspiciously like regret. "But if you'll let me, I want to be here now, for him, for you." Her chest tightened painfully. "I don't know how to trust you with him," she admitted. "I'm not even sure I know how to trust you with me." Blair's hands closed into loose fists. "Then let me earn it. Both." The rawness in his tone undid something in her. Blair Burlington never asked. He demanded, negotiated, bought. But now he was asking, offering something no amount of money could guarantee, a second chance. Morgan rose, arms folding tightly around herself. "I need time," she said. "We both do." "You'll have it?" Blair promised. Morgan nodded once, curtly. "Connor's world is small, safe. I'm not going to let anything or anyone hurt him." Blair stood too, an almost imperceptible tremor running through him. "I understand." They stood facing each other, the weight of the years and the choices between them heavy but not insurmountable. For the first time since seeing him again, Morgan allowed herself to hope, just a little, that maybe they weren't standing on opposite sides anymore. Maybe, just maybe, they were standing at the beginning of something new. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the penthouse windows, casting a pale glow across the sharp lines of Blair Burlington's living room. Manhattan stretched out below him, a glittering kingdom he'd once ruled with ruthless precision. Today, it felt hollow. Blair stood motionless by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, untouched. His reflection stared back at him, tailored, polished, and for the first time in years, utterly uncertain. The night's revelations haunted him. A son. Connor. The word sat heavy in his chest, more staggering than any boardroom defeat he'd ever known. His phone buzzed on the marble coffee table, a reminder of the world still demanding his attention. Meetings, contracts, deadlines, the architecture of a life meticulously built on ambition. He set the coffee aside and reached for the phone. "Good morning, Mr. Burlington," Laura's voice chimed, efficient as always. "I have your schedule for the day ready, along with the draft contracts from Tokyo. Also, the CFO from London is hoping to confirm." "Laura," Blair interrupted, his voice measured but firm. She paused. "Yes, sir?" "Clear my schedule," he said. "Reschedule or delegate everything." Another pause, longer this time. In all her years working for him, Laura had never heard him willingly step away from business. "Everything, sir?" she asked carefully. "Everything," Blair confirmed. Silence hummed across the line before Laura answered, professionalism snapping into place. "Understood, Mr. Burlington. I'll handle it." He ended the call without ceremony, dropping the phone back onto the table with a soft clatter. Pushing aside obligations, pushing aside the empire he had fought so hard to build, Blair realized it should have terrified him. Instead, it felt inevitable. He wasn't strategizing mergers today. He wasn't chasing market shares. He was chasing something far rarer, far more fragile. His son. Blair moved through the penthouse like a man seeing it for the first time. Sleek furniture, priceless artwork, every surface gleaming. It was a monument to success, but it wasn't built for a life. Not for laughter, not for scraped knees or bedtime stories. Connor deserved more than this. Morgan deserved more. Blair grabbed his jacket from the back of a leather chair, slipping it on with a sharp movement. The stakes had changed overnight, and for once, the future he wanted couldn't be bought with closing deals or power plays. It had to be earned. With steady steps, Blair walked out the door into a city he had once conquered, ready to fight for something far more precious. This time, he wasn't playing to win. He was playing for keeps. Morgan smoothed her palms down the front of her worn jeans, pacing the narrow strip of floor between the couch and the window. She hated feeling this unsettled. She hated even more that Blair's voice, his promises, kept replaying in her mind. A sharp knock sounded at the door, and she startled, heart pounding harder than it should have. Squaring her shoulders, she opened it. Blair stood there, dressed down in a simple button-up and jeans, still devastatingly put together, but without the impenetrable armor of the CEO she remembered. There was something rawer about him now, something she couldn't define, and wasn't sure she trusted yet. "Morning," he said, almost tentative. "Morning," Morgan replied, stepping aside. Connor sat cross-legged on the floor, absorbed in stacking blocks into a precarious tower. He looked up, eyes curious but cautious, when Blair entered. The small tension in the boy's shoulders didn't escape Blair's notice. Morgan led Blair into the kitchen, where they could talk without little ears catching every word. Blair leaned against the counter, arms loosely crossed, waiting. "I want to see him," he said quietly. "I want to be part of his life. Not just visits. Not half measures." Morgan folded her arms, mirroring him without realizing it. "I figured that much." Blair's jaw tightened. I know I don't have the right to demand anything, but I'm asking. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm the frantic thud of her heart. You can't just show up and expect everything to be fine. I don't, he said quickly. I know I have to prove I'm not going anywhere, that I'm not the man who left you behind. Morgan studied him, searching for the familiar arrogance she used to hate and love. But what she found instead was determination and fear. You're good at promises, Blair, she said carefully. Keeping them, that's something else. I intend to keep this one, he said, voice low, sincere. Morgan hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision settle onto her chest. Okay, she said finally, on my terms. A flicker of relief crossed Blair's face, but he didn't relax. He was smart enough to know the hard part wasn't over. You can see Connor, Morgan continued, but it's gradual, short visits. Here or somewhere safe. No introducing him to your world yet. No reporters, no headlines, no sudden moves. Agreed, Blair said immediately. And if you start to drift, if you disappear back into your old life, I'll shut the door again, permanently. The warning in her voice was clear. Blair nodded once, solemnly. I understand. Morgan wasn't sure if he truly did. She wasn't sure she even did. But some part of her, the part that remembered the man who once held her so tenderly, wanted to believe. A soft thump interrupted them. Connor had wandered into the kitchen, dragging a picture book in one hand. He looked up at Blair with wide, uncertain eyes. Morgan knelt down, smoothing a hand over her son's hair. Connor, remember Mr. Blair from the airplane? Connor nodded shyly, clutching the book tighter. Would it be okay, Morgan asked gently, if he stayed for a little while? Connor's brow furrowed, considering. Then slowly, hesitantly, he extended the book toward Blair. The simple gesture undid something deep inside Blair. He dropped into a crouch, accepting the book carefully as if it were made of glass. I'd be honored, he said softly. Morgan watched them, her heart tight with fear and hope. It wasn't trust yet, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. And sometimes the first step was the hardest and the most important. Blair sat stiffly on the living room floor, legs awkwardly crossed, the picture book spread open between him and Connor. It was a strange battlefield to find himself on. He had negotiated hostile mergers, argued billion-dollar contracts into submission, and steered entire companies through crises. Yet nothing had prepared him for the challenge of entertaining a 3-year-old. Connor studied him with cautious eyes, one tiny finger tapping the colorful illustrations. You like dinosaurs? Blair ventured, his voice a little rough. Connor nodded solemnly. Big ones, he whispered. Blair's mouth curved into a faint smile. Yeah, me too. Which one's your favorite? Connor's brow furrowed in concentration as he flipped the pages, stopping to point at a fierce, toothy T-Rex. Blair leaned closer. Good choice. King of the dinosaurs, right? Connor's small shoulders straightened slightly, pride flickering across his face. Morgan watched from the kitchen, pretending to sort mail, though her eyes never strayed far from them. She was giving them space, but her tension filled the room like static electricity. Blair cleared his throat. You know, he said casually, I used to think the T-Rex was unbeatable. But you know what's even better than being the biggest? Connor shook his head, eyes wide. Having a team, Blair said. Friends. People who help you when you get stuck. Connor considered that with the seriousness only young children could muster, then nodded again, satisfied. Blair exhaled, feeling some of the tightness in his chest ease. One small step, one tiny bridge built. Want to build a team? Blair asked, nodding toward the stack of blocks Connor had abandoned earlier. Connor's face lit up with a tentative smile, the first one Blair had seen directed at him, and he scrambled to his feet, grabbing the blocks. Blair followed, awkward but willing, letting Connor hand him brightly colored pieces as they began stacking a lopsided tower together. The minutes slipped by, clumsy laughter replacing the awkward silences. Morgan stayed quiet, letting the scene unfold, a lump forming in her throat. She hadn't expected Blair to be good at this. Not really. She had prepared herself for indifference, for frustration, for a polite sense of duty. But this, Blair leaning in, listening, laughing at the tower's inevitable collapse, this was something she hadn't dared to imagine. When Connor toppled the tower with a gleeful shout, Blair threw his hands up in mock despair, drawing a giggle from the boy that was pure, unfiltered joy. Morgan's heart twisted painfully. Blair caught her gaze across the room and held it, something raw and unguarded flashing between them. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't polished, but he was trying. And maybe, just maybe, that mattered more than anything else. Blair leaned against the hood of his car, the streetlights casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Morgan had insisted Connor needed his nap, and though Blair had reluctantly agreed, he found himself lingering. Unable to drive away. Across the street, the brownstone windows glowed softly, a life unfolding inside that he should have been part of from the beginning. Blair dragged a hand through his hair, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, wasn't used to watching from the sidelines while someone else set the rules. But Morgan was right. He had forfeited the right to demand anything. Now he could only prove he deserved another chance. He tilted his head back, staring up at the darkening sky. And for the first time in a long time, memories crept in, uninvited and unrelenting. Late nights in London, conference rooms where the lights never turned off, deals that bled into dawn, calls from Morgan that he had silenced because meetings couldn't wait. The last night they had spent together played in his mind like an old reel. Morgan standing at the door of his apartment, her arms crossed, her expression fragile but fierce. "I'm not asking you to give up your dreams, Blair. I'm asking if there's still room for me in them." And he, so sure of his path, so arrogant in his certainty, had offered half-truths and hollow reassurances, telling her to be patient, telling her they'd figure it out later. Only there had never been a later. He had boarded that plane to London without looking back, convinced he had time. Convinced that she, and anything that didn't fit neatly into his ambition, could wait. Blair pushed away from the car with a low curse under his breath, pacing the length of the sidewalk. He hadn't just abandoned Morgan. He had abandoned the version of himself who might have had something real. And now, 3 years later, he was standing at the edge of something infinitely more precious and infinitely more fragile. Connor's small hand reaching for him earlier, Morgan's guarded expression softening ever so slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was hope. And Blair realized with a sudden, bone-deep clarity that he wanted that hope more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. He wasn't the man Morgan had needed back then, but maybe, just maybe, he could become the man she and Connor needed now. Squaring his shoulders, Blair slid into the driver's seat, determination hardening in his chest. Tomorrow, and every day after, he would show them, not with promises, not with grand gestures, but with patience, with presence, with the kind of love that didn't ask for anything in return. He wasn't here to take back what he lost. He was here to build something new. Morgan stirred a pot of soup on the stove, the rhythmic motion doing little to settle her nerves. Connor sat at the kitchen table, coloring with fierce concentration, the tip of his tongue peeking out as he filled in the lines. His quiet presence was a balm to her frayed emotions, a reminder of why she needed to be strong. When the knock came, soft but deliberate, Morgan wiped her hands on a dish towel and squared her shoulders. Blair stood on the other side of the door, casual in jeans and a sweater, his hair a little wind-tossed. For a moment, just a moment, she saw the man he might have been if life had pulled them in a different direction. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Blair entered cautiously, as if aware that every move he made mattered. Morgan appreciated it more than she let on. Connor peeked up from his coloring book and offered Blair a shy wave. Blair grinned, tentative but genuine, and Connor ducked his head, a tiny smile playing at his lips. Morgan waited until Connor was engrossed again before motioning Blair toward the living room. "We need to talk," she said once they were seated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Blair nodded. "I'm listening." Morgan took a breath. She had rehearsed this 100 times in her mind. "This can't be your schedule, your convenience, your terms," she said. "Not this time." Blair didn't flinch. He sat, hands resting loosely on his thighs, letting her speak. "You want to be part of Connor's life? Fine. But you show up when you say you will. No broken promises, no disappearing acts." "Agreed," Blair said quietly. Morgan pressed on. "No overnight visits. Not yet. Not until he knows you better. We take it slow. Outings to the park, trips to the museum, things that are safe for him." "Whatever you think is best," Blair said. She blinked, caught off guard by the lack of resistance. "And no, press," she added. "No photos splashed across magazines, no interviews where his existence becomes a story." Blair's jaw tightened for the first time, but he nodded. "I'll keep him out of it." Completely. Morgan's shoulders eased a fraction. And me, she said, softer now. I'm not stepping back into whatever this is. Not until I see you mean it. Not until I see you're here for the right reasons. Blair leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze steady. I am here, he said. For him. For you. I don't expect trust overnight, but I'm not walking away. Morgan's throat tightened painfully. Part of her wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. The other part, the wary part that had picked up the pieces when he left, knew better than to fall so easily. You'll have to earn it, she said, voice low. I intend to, Blair said without hesitation. Connor toddled into the room then, waving a crayon triumphantly. Look, he said, beaming. Dinosaur! Morgan smiled and knelt to admire the drawing. Blair crouched beside her, a rare softness on his face as he admired scrawled T-Rex. It wasn't a family yet. It wasn't even a beginning, not really. But it was a possibility, and sometimes, Morgan thought, possibilities were enough to start with. Blair adjusted the strap of the small backpack slung over his shoulder, a loaner from Morgan, filled with snacks, wipes, and a battered storybook Connor had insisted on bringing along. It was a crisp Saturday morning, the kind that hinted at spring, but still held the sharpness of winter in the air. Central Park was alive with families, joggers, and the occasional dog bounding after a tennis ball. Connor clutched Blair's hand tightly as they made their way down one of the winding paths, his small fingers dwarfed by Blair's larger grip. Every few steps, Connor glanced up at him, as if checking to make sure Blair was still real, still there. Blair squeezed his hand gently each time. Morgan had walked them to the park entrance before stepping back, letting them have this time together. She hadn't said much, just a soft call if you need me and a look that said she would be watching. Always. Connor tugged him toward a small playground, his face lighting up at the sight of the bright slides and climbing structures. You want to go play? Blair asked, crouching down to his level. Connor nodded shyly. Blair helped him onto the steps leading up to the slide, staying close but giving him space. Other parents hovered nearby, some chatting easily, others glued to their phones. Blair stood out, he knew, too stiff, too wary, but he didn't care. Connor scrambled up the ladder, hesitated at the top, then shot down the slide with a delighted shriek. Blair's heart twisted at the sound. It was so pure, so full of joy, and he hadn't been there to hear it before now. Connor ran back to him, breathless, cheeks flushed pink. Again, he declared. Blair laughed, the sound rusty but real. Go for it, buddy. They spent the better part of an hour at the playground, Connor running, climbing, laughing, and Blair chasing after him with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. When Connor finally tired, they settled on a bench with juice boxes and crackers. Blair opened the worn storybook, Connor curling against his side without hesitation. Blair read aloud, stumbling occasionally over the silly dinosaur names, but Connor didn't seem to mind. He giggled and corrected him once, then nestled closer, warm and trusting. Blair closed the book after the last page and stared out across the park, the city skyline jagged against the pale blue sky. He thought about the life he had built, the towering offices, the gleaming deals, the endless striving, and he thought about this moment, simple and quiet, with a little boy who didn't care about any of that. Blair looked down at Connor, who was dozing lightly against him, thumb hooked in the strap of Blair's jacket. He bent his head low, speaking so softly the words were almost a breath. I promise, Connor, he whispered. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. The boy stirred but didn't wake, secure in the arms of a man just beginning to understand the meaning of true commitment. Blair tightened his hold, feeling the weight of the promise settle deep into his bones. This was the start. Not of an empire, not of another conquest, but of a family, and he would fight for it with everything he had. Blair double-checked the address Morgan had texted him, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. The modest brick building housing the daycare center looked friendly enough, bright murals on the windows, a fenced-in playground at the side, but Blair still felt like he was walking into unknown territory. He wasn't here to close a deal. He wasn't here to win. He was here to pick up his son. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile as he stepped inside, the scent of crayons and disinfectant hanging faintly in the air. Can I help you? She asked. Blair Burlington, he said, trying to sound less intimidating than he felt. I'm here for Connor Brown. His mother, Morgan Brown, put me on the pickup list. The woman scanned the sheet in front of her, then nodded. "One moment, Mr. Burlington." Blair waited awkwardly by the door, feeling like every eye in the building was on him, even though the only real audience was a group of toddlers wriggling through circle time. A few moments later, Connor came barreling down the hallway, his small backpack bouncing against his back. He skidded to a halt when he spotted Blair, eyes widening. For a second, uncertainty flickered across his face, but then he broke into a grin. Blair crouched instinctively, opening his arms. Connor crashed into him without hesitation, his tiny arms looping around Blair's neck. Blair exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "Missed you." Connor pulled back, beaming. "Look, I made it." He thrust a finger-painted masterpiece at Blair, an enthusiastic, if abstract, explosion of color. Blair took the paper carefully, as if it were a priceless document. "It's perfect," he said solemnly. Connor giggled and tugged at Blair's sleeve. "Come on! Hungry!" Blair rose to his full height, still clutching the painting, and followed Connor out into the afternoon sun. Morgan had warned him that she had a meeting and wouldn't be free until later, which meant for the next few hours, Blair Burlington, the man who negotiated international mergers before breakfast, was officially on full-time dad duty. Connor tugged him toward a food truck parked at the curb. "Hot dog," he demanded. Blair hesitated. He hadn't eaten from a street cart in years, but when Connor's face lit up with hope, the decision was easy. "Hot dog it is," Blair said, fishing a 20 out of his wallet. They sat on a nearby bench, Connor perched happily beside him, his legs too short to reach the ground. Blair watched the boy demolish his food with single-minded enthusiasm, ketchup smeared across his cheek. He couldn't help but laugh quietly to himself. This was messy, unplanned, completely imperfect, and he loved it more than anything he could remember. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a familiar rhythm of reminders, meeting alerts, missed calls. Blair silenced it without a glance. Today, the Empire could wait. Today, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Connor wriggled closer, holding out the last bite of his hot dog in an offering Blair didn't dare refuse. He leaned in, took a ridiculous bite, and smiled when Connor laughed. They were building something, brick by brick, bite by bite, without contracts, without strategy. Just trust, just time. And maybe Blair thought as he wiped ketchup off Connor's chin with a napkin, that was the strongest foundation of all. Blair's conference room was a sea of glass and chrome, the kind of place where empires were born and dismantled daily. Normally, he thrived here, energized by the stakes, the adrenaline of high-level decision-making. Today, all he could think about was the little boy seated quietly in the corner, building towers out of copy paper and spare binders. Connor sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, humming to himself, completely unfazed by the suits and tension swirling around him. Blair adjusted his tie, feeling absurdly overdressed. He hadn't planned it this way. Morgan's meeting had run overtime, and when she'd called, apologetic and flustered, asking for just another hour, Blair had said yes without hesitation. What he hadn't anticipated was Connor coming to work with him. The board members glanced curiously at the child in the corner, but to their credit, no one said a word. Blair's reputation carried enough weight to make even the most seasoned executive think twice before commenting. Still, as the meeting droned on, projections, quarterly forecasts, expansion strategies, Blair found his focus slipping. His gaze kept drifting to Connor, to the careful way he stacked the papers, to the soft hum of a made-up song under his breath. "Mr. Burlington?" one of the directors prompted. Blair blinked, dragging his mind back to the present. "Right," he said smoothly, recovering. "The Singapore deal. I'll review the new terms personally." The man nodded, satisfied. Blair closed the folder in front of him with a quiet snap. "We'll adjourn for now. I want revised reports by Monday." There was a shuffling of papers, the scrape of chairs. Blair didn't miss the relieved expressions as the executives filed out, most of them not eager to stay longer than necessary under his scrutiny. Once the door closed behind them, Blair walked over to Connor. The boy looked up at him with a wide, innocent smile. "Look," he said proudly, pointing to his tower. Blair crouched down, admiring the precarious structure. "Impressive," he said seriously. "Architect in the making." Connor giggled, clearly pleased. Blair sat cross-legged beside him, unbothered by the $1,000 suit wrinkling under him. "How about we build an even bigger one?" Blair asked. Connor's face lit up. Yeah! They got to work, Blair letting his mind clear for the first time that day. Paper towers, binder bridges, nothing strategic, nothing critical. Just simple moments stacking up one after another. Laura poked her head in at one point, her usual efficient demeanor slipping into something gentler when she spotted the scene. I rescheduled your afternoon meeting, sir, she said, a knowing glint in her eye. Thank you, Laura, Blair said, without looking up. She nodded once and quietly closed the door. Blair balanced another binder atop their lopsided structure and leaned back to admire it. Pretty good team, huh? He said. Connor nodded fiercely. The best. Blair smiled, the tight knot of tension in his chest easing. For so long, he had measured success by numbers, by accolades, by closing deals no one else could. Now, success looked like a paper tower, a child's laughter, and a tiny hand reaching for his without hesitation. Blair realized he would trade 1,000 boardrooms for this, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was losing anything at all. He felt like he was finally winning where it mattered most. Here's Chapter 13, continuing naturally with the same emotional depth and polished pacing. Yours to keep. Section 2, A Love Rekindled, Chapter 13, Opening Old Wounds. Morgan sat on the worn love seat in her living room, a mug of tea cooling between her palms. Through the open doorway, she could hear Connor giggling, loud, unfiltered peals of joy as Blair chased him down the narrow hallway, pretending to be a roaring dinosaur. Morgan smiled despite herself, the sound lifting something heavy from her chest. Blair was good with Connor, better than she had expected, better than she had dared to hope. She sipped her tea absently, trying to ignore the sharp ache curling low in her stomach. Every time she watched Blair with Connor, every time she caught a glimpse of the man he was trying to be, a dangerous thought whispered through her mind. What if this time was different? What if he meant it? Morgan squeezed her eyes shut, anger and longing tangling inside her. She had spent so long building walls, around her life, around her heart. Blair had once been the reason she started stacking those in the first place. It hadn't just been ambition that had torn them apart. It had been the way Blair made everything else come first. The way she always felt like an afterthought when board meetings ran late, when mergers consumed his attention, when "I love you" sounded like a promise he didn't have time to keep. Morgan had survived the collapse of those promises. Barely. And now, watching him tickle their son until Connor was breathless with laughter, she felt those old wounds stir, the same hope, the same fear. The worst part was knowing how easy it would be to fall back into him. Blair still had that gravity about him, that certainty that made you want to believe whatever he said. That pull hadn't faded over time. If anything, it had sharpened, honed by years of absence. Footsteps padded into the room, breaking her spiraling thoughts. Connor clambered onto the couch beside her, flushed and panting, his arms flung around her waist. Blair followed a moment later, looking rumpled but happier than Morgan had ever seen him. He paused, sensing the shift in her mood, his easy smile fading into something more cautious. "You okay?" he asked quietly, almost tentative. Morgan forced a smile, smoothing Connor's hair as he snuggled into her side. "Yeah, just tired." Blair nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He sat down on the armchair across from her, elbows resting on his knees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything unsaid filled the space between them. Finally, Blair broke the silence. "I know I hurt you," he said, voice rough. "I know sorry doesn't fix it." Morgan met his gaze, surprised by the raw honesty there. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I need consistency." Blair nodded slowly. "Then that's what you'll get." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a promise wrapped in flowers and empty words. It was simple, steady. And maybe, Morgan thought, it was exactly what she needed. Still, her heart stayed cautious, tucked behind old scars. Connor shifted against her, murmuring something about dinosaurs and hot dogs, and Morgan kissed the top of his head, grounding herself. She didn't have the luxury of fairy tales. Not anymore. Not for herself. But maybe, just maybe, for her son's sake, she could believe in small beginnings. One quiet day at a time. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through Morgan's kitchen window, casting golden pools of warmth across the countertop. Blair leaned against the doorway, arms crossed loosely, watching as Morgan packed away Connor's toys with brisk efficiency. Connor was napping after an afternoon of playground adventures, his tiny frame curled up on the couch under a fleece blanket. Blair cleared his throat softly. Morgan glanced up, wary but composed. "I was thinking," Blair said, tone casual but edged with something more vulnerable. "Maybe you and Connor could come over for dinner. Nothing fancy, just something easy." Morgan straightened, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "Dinner?" Blair nodded. "Yeah, I'll cook." Morgan arched a skeptical brow. "You? Cook?" Blair grinned, the boyish flash of it catching her off guard. "I'm capable of boiling pasta, and I can order takeout like a professional." Morgan couldn't help the soft chuckle that escaped her. "And what's the occasion?" Blair shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Just thought it might be nice. Connor can see where I live. No pressure, no expectations." Morgan's fingers toyed with the hem of her sweater. Part of her wanted to say no, to keep things compartmentalized, safe, but the earnestness in Blair's expression, the gentle patience he was trying so hard to maintain, chipped away at her defenses. "Okay," she said finally, "but keep it low-key. He gets overwhelmed easily." Blair's smile widened, a rare thing that made him look almost young. "Low-key," he promised. "You'll see." Morgan hesitated. "Are you sure? Your place?" She trailed off, thinking of the sleek, intimidating photos she had once seen in business profiles. Blair's voice softened. "If it's not right, we'll leave. I want him to feel comfortable. You too." Morgan studied him for a long moment, weighing trust against caution, instinct against fear. Finally, she nodded. "All right, dinner." Blair exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath, waiting for her answer. "I'll send you the address," he said. "Come by around 6?" Morgan nodded again. And Blair pushed off the doorway, glancing once more toward the couch where Connor slept. "I'll see you tonight," he said, and there was a quiet promise in the words. Morgan watched him leave, her heart a knotted mess of emotions. She told herself it was just dinner, nothing more, no expectations, but deep down, some fragile part of her knew better. Tonight would be a test, a glimpse into a life that might have been, and maybe, if she dared hope, a life that could still be. Morgan stood outside Blair's building, Connor's hands snug in hers, staring up at the sleek lines of glass and stone. It was exactly the kind of place she had imagined Blair would live, elegant, commanding, quietly intimidating. She swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to turn around and run. Connor tugged at her hand, oblivious to her hesitation. "Come on, Mama." Morgan forced a smile and led him inside. The doorman greeted them with a polite nod, and a few minutes later, they were riding the elevator up to the top floor. Connor craned his neck to look out the glass wall, oohing at the sprawling view of the city. Morgan clutched his small backpack tighter, nerves twisting in her stomach. When the elevator doors slid open, Blair was already waiting. He wore jeans and a dark sweater, his usual sharpness softened by the casual clothes and the easy smile he offered them. "Hey," he said, stepping forward. His gaze flickered to Connor first, then to her. "Hi," Morgan replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Blair crouched down to Connor's level. "You ready for some pizza?" Connor's face lit up. "Pizza!" Blair grinned. "Come on in." He held the door wide as they stepped inside. Morgan looked around, taking it all in, the soaring ceilings, the gleaming floors, the view that stretched to the horizon. It was beautiful, impeccable, and somehow strangely cold, until she spotted the blanket fort in the corner. A careful construction of chairs, throw blankets, and pillows, complete with a small stack of books and a flashlight. Morgan blinked, startled by the unexpected sweetness of it. Blair rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly self-conscious, thought he might like it, didn't know if this place would feel kid-friendly enough. Morgan's heart squeezed painfully. She wasn't sure what hit her harder, the awkwardness in his voice or the sheer effort he had made to welcome Connor. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. Connor immediately darted toward the fort, squealing with delight. Morgan turned back to Blair, who was watching his son with a tenderness that caught her completely off guard. They moved into the kitchen, where takeout boxes were spread across the counter. Blair opened one, revealing pizzas, garlic knots, and a small mountain of fries. "I figured safe bets," he said, with a small smile. Morgan chuckled, the tension easing a little. "You figured right." They sat at the kitchen island, Connor chattering between mouthfuls. telling Blair about dinosaurs, trucks, and a dog he had seen at the park. Blair listened, truly listened, nodding and asking questions, his focus entirely on the little boy beside him. Morgan watched them, her defenses eroding with every passing minute. It would have been easier if Blair were distant, if he had treated Connor like an obligation, a checkbox to be ticked. But he didn't. He leaned in. He cared. And the sincerity of it rattled the careful walls she had built around her heart. After dinner, Connor yawned theatrically, rubbing his eyes. "I think someone's ready for the fort," Morgan said with a smile. Connor scampered off without argument, diving into the pile of pillows. Morgan gathered the plates, but Blair stopped her with a gentle touch to her wrist. "Leave it," he said. "Stay a minute." Something in his voice, something soft and almost pleading, made her pause. They moved to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch as Connor read to himself under the blanket fort. The distance between them felt wider than the length of the sofa, wider than the years they had lost. Morgan wrapped her arms around her knees, resting her chin on top, studying Blair carefully. "You're different," she said quietly. Blair's mouth quirked into a humorless smile. "Life has a way of doing that." They sat in silence, the city lights glittering beyond the windows, the low murmur of Connor's voice filling the space between them. "I'm scared," Morgan admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Blair's head turned sharply toward her, but he didn't interrupt. "I'm scared of believing this could be real," she said, "that you could stay." Blair leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees, hands clasped together. "I'm scared too," he said simply. "Scared of screwing it up, scared of not being enough for him, for you." Their eyes met across the distance. No anger, no accusations, just vulnerability laid bare. Blair let out a shaky breath. "But I'm here," he said, "and I'm not leaving." Morgan stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But trust wasn't a switch she could flip. It would take time, patience, proof. Still, something deep inside her stirred, the faintest stirring of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild, not the life they once imagined, but something even stronger, something earned. Morgan smiled, small, tentative, but real. Blair smiled back, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like the beginning of something worth fighting for. Blair leaned back against the couch, his gaze fixed on the glittering skyline beyond the windows. Morgan sat a few feet away, cradling a mug of coffee Blair had made for her. The silence between them was no longer tense. It felt almost comfortable, almost fragile, like something that might break if either of them moved too quickly. Connor's soft snores drifted from the blanket fort, a steady, soothing reminder of the little boy at the center of it all. Blair let the quiet stretch out, his heart pounding harder than it ever had during any corporate negotiation. He knew this was his moment, not a chance to sell himself, but a chance to be honest in a way he never had before. "I wasn't ready back then," he said finally, voice low. Morgan looked at him but didn't speak. "I thought I was," Blair continued. "I thought if I could just build enough, make enough, control enough, it would all fall into place." He laughed quietly, a humorless sound. "But it didn't. I pushed everything else aside. You, us, because I thought love, family was something you made room for after you succeeded, after you proved yourself." Morgan's fingers tightened around her mug, but she stayed silent, listening. Blair rubbed his hands over his face, searching for the right words. "I used to think loving someone would make me weak," he said. "That if I let myself want you too much, I'd lose focus, lose the edge that kept me ahead." He dropped his hands, turning his head to look at her. "And I did lose it," he said, "but not because I loved you, because I let fear win." Morgan's eyes shimmered, but her face remained steady. "You didn't even call," she said softly. "You just left." "I know." His voice cracked slightly. "Every time I thought about picking up the phone, I told myself you were better off, that you deserved someone who could be there, fully there. And yet you never asked me what I wanted," Morgan said, the faintest edge to her voice. Blair knew the guilt heavy in his chest. "I was a coward," he admitted, "too proud, too scared to hear that maybe you didn't need me anymore." Morgan swallowed hard, looking away. "I needed you. I just needed you to choose me." Blair's throat tightened. "I'm choosing you now," he said, the words trembling in the space between them. "Not because it's easy, not because it's convenient, but because it's the only thing that feels right. Morgan blinked rapidly, fighting the sting of tears. She had waited so long to hear something like this, to feel seen, prioritized, cherished. And yet, hearing it now didn't erase the years of silence, didn't erase the part of her that was still so afraid. "I don't know if I can just pick up where we left off," she said, honestly. "I'm not asking you to," Blair said. "I don't deserve that. I want a chance to earn my way back." Morgan looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the ambitious, untouchable CEO the world knew, but the man underneath, the man who had made mistakes, the man willing to own them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the walls she had built around her heart, a beginning. Morgan set her mug down carefully and folded her hands in her lap. "I'm scared," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Blair's expression softened. "So am I." They sat there, two imperfect people trying to find a way forward, the city lights casting them in muted gold. Maybe love wasn't about certainty. Maybe it was about choosing each other every day, even when it was hard. Morgan drew in a shaky breath. "One step at a time," she said. Blair smiled, small, real, and infinitely more powerful than any vow. "One step," he agreed, and for the first time in a long time, the distance between them didn't feel so impossible after all. Morgan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, staring out at the endless city lights. Blair watched her from the couch, heart thudding in his chest with an unfamiliar, raw kind of hope. They hadn't said much after their conversation, both too emotionally spent, too aware that some things needed space to settle before they could be named. Connor still slept soundly, tucked into a makeshift nest of pillows and blankets. His even breathing filled the room with a quiet comfort neither of them dared disturb. Blair rose slowly, moving toward her. Morgan didn't turn right away, but when she finally did, her face was caught in the soft glow of the city. Vulnerable. Tired. Beautiful. "You should get some sleep," she murmured. "So should you," he said gently. They stood there, just looking at each other, the silence humming with something unspoken but powerful. Blair took a step closer. He didn't rush it, didn't reach for her. Instead, he gave her every opportunity to move away. Morgan stayed exactly where she was. "I don't want to ruin this," Blair said quietly. "You're not," Morgan whispered. Her eyes searched his, as if trying to find the pieces of the man she had once loved, and the man he was trying to become now. Blair reached out slowly, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek, his fingertips feather-light. Morgan's breath caught. Neither of them moved for a heartbeat. Then two. Blair dipped his head, giving her every second to pull away. Morgan rose onto her toes, barely just enough, and their lips met in a kiss so tentative it was more like a question than an answer. Soft. Searching. New. Blair stilled, savoring the fragile contact, the heat that flared between them, not with urgency but with something far more dangerous. Hope. Morgan's hand drifted up to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid thrum of his heart against her palm. He deepened the kiss slightly, testing, asking. Morgan responded with a small, trembling sigh, her body relaxing into his. It wasn't a kiss to claim. It wasn't a kiss to conquer. It was a kiss that said, "I'm still here." A kiss that said, "I remember." A kiss that said, "Maybe." When they finally broke apart, their foreheads touched, breaths mingling. Morgan's fingers tightened briefly against his shirt, as if anchoring herself. Blair cupped her face gently, memorizing the feel of her skin under his hands, the way she leaned into his touch so instinctively. Neither spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. Not yet. For now, it was enough to stand there, wrapped in the fragile, breathtaking possibility that maybe love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Maybe it was about choosing each other in the quiet, messy, beautiful in-between spaces. And Blair knew, with absolute certainty, that this time, he wasn't letting go. Morning crept into the city slowly, the light a soft, muted gray that painted the skyline in shades of steel and silver. Morgan stirred awake on the couch, the blanket Blair had draped over her slipping to the floor. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, before the memories of the night before settled around her like a second skin. The kiss, the look in Blair's eyes, the silent promises that had passed between them. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. Across the room, she spotted Connor still burrowed under the blankets of the makeshift fort, his small frame rising and falling with steady breaths. And Blair, he wasn't there. A jolt of panic sparked in her chest before she heard the faint clatter of dishes coming from the kitchen. She rose, padding across the polished floor. Blair stood at the stove, sleeves pushed up, attempting, with questionable success, to make pancakes. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard her and smiled sheepishly. "Morning," he said, flipping something that vaguely resembled a pancake. Morgan crossed her arms, watching him. It would have been so easy to let the warmth of last night carry over, to pretend that everything was fine now, that the years of distance and heartbreak had been erased with a single kiss. But that wasn't real. And Morgan had promised herself, promised Connor, she wouldn't lose herself to wishful thinking again. "Blair," she said softly. He turned, spatula in hand, sensing the change in her immediately. She stepped closer, struggling to find the right words. Last night was... She trailed off, pressing her lips together before starting again. "It was nice. It meant something." "It did," Blair agreed, voice steady. "But," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze, "it doesn't change everything." Blair set the spatula down carefully, leaning his hip against the counter. "I know," he said. "I'm not expecting it to." Morgan exhaled slowly, relieved he wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding more than she could give. "I need time," she said. "For Connor, for myself. I'm still figuring this out." Blair nodded. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The simple acceptance in his voice undid something in her. He wasn't trying to control the situation. He wasn't trying to force a resolution. He was offering her the space she needed, the space she had begged for once, long ago, and never received. Morgan wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly exposed. "I'm scared," she admitted again, surprising even herself with the rawness of it. Blair's mouth curved into a soft, bittersweet smile. "So am I," he said. "But some things are worth being scared for." They stood there, the morning light stretching between them, cautious but real. Connor stirred in the living room, his small voice calling out sleepily. Morgan turned toward the sound, and Blair stepped back, giving her the space to go to their son. As she knelt beside Connor, helping him sit up and rubbing the sleep from his eyes, Morgan felt the weight of Blair's gaze on her, not possessive, not impatient, just present. And maybe, she thought, that was enough for now. Maybe real love wasn't about rushing forward. Maybe it was about showing up. Every day, without expectation, without conditions. Morgan pulled Connor into her arms, inhaling the familiar scent of his hair, and allowed herself the smallest, trembling breath of hope. She wasn't ready to give Blair her heart again, but maybe, just maybe, she was ready to see what it looked like to let him try. The office lobby gleamed under the midday sun, all sleek marble and polished chrome. Blair adjusted his cufflinks absently, his nerves sharper than he would ever admit. He was used to taking risks, calculated ones, predictable ones. But this felt different, more personal. He glanced at his watch. Morgan would be here any minute. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped out, wearing a navy dress and carrying a worn leather portfolio under one arm. Her hair was pulled back, a few wisps escaping around her face, and she looked, Blair realized with a jolt, both utterly professional and completely out of place in this sterile, relentless world. She spotted him immediately, her expression wary but composed. "Thanks for meeting me," Blair said, falling into step beside her as they crossed the lobby. Morgan nodded. "You said it was about a project." "It is," Blair said carefully. They entered a smaller conference room, a more private space Blair had chosen deliberately. He didn't want her feeling like she was being paraded around in front of his board or staff. Morgan settled into a chair, setting her portfolio in front of her. Blair sat across from her, taking a breath before speaking. "I have a project coming up," he began, "a redesign of the executive suites and client lounges. It's overdue. We've been putting it off for years." Morgan arched an eyebrow. "And you want me to bid on it?" Blair shook his head. "No, I want you to lead it." Morgan blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I trust your taste," Blair said simply. "I trust your vision. And," his voice dropped slightly, "I want to support what you're building, not because of, but because you're good at what you do." Morgan studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. "And what about your partners? Your board? They'll want someone with a big name." They'll get over it, Blair said without hesitation. I'm the CEO. It's my call. Morgan leaned back, crossing her arms loosely. This isn't charity, Blair. If I do this, it's because I earn it, not because you're trying to make up for the past. Blair smiled faintly, something warm flickering in his eyes. That's exactly why I want you. Morgan was silent for a long moment, weighing the offer. It was tempting, more tempting than she wanted to admit, not just for the exposure or the paycheck, but because somewhere deep down it felt like he was finally seeing her, not as an accessory, not as a distraction, but as a person with her own dreams, her own talents. Still, caution pressed against her ribs. You know this complicates things, she said. I know, Blair said, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Morgan's fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the table. Finally, she nodded. I'll look at the project, see if it's the right fit. Blair smiled, relief evident in the small crease around his eyes. That's all I'm asking. Morgan stood, gathering her things. As she moved toward the door, Blair rose too, hesitating. You're not a project to me, Morgan, he said quietly. You never were. She paused, her hand on the door, her back still to him. I'm not looking to be saved, she said, her voice calm but firm. Blair's voice was just as steady when he answered. Good, because I'm not here to save you. I'm just hoping to walk beside you, if you'll let me. Morgan turned, meeting his gaze. The weight of his sincerity wrapped around her, pulling at the fragile thread of trust still binding them together. She gave him a small, guarded smile. One step at a time. Blair nodded, and for once, he didn't try to push for more. He simply let her walk away, trusting that this time she wouldn't be walking alone. Morgan sat at her small kitchen table later that night, Connor fast asleep in the next room, the portfolio Blair had given her spread open in front of her. Blueprints, concept notes, client expectations. It was a real project. A big one. Not a favor. Not a handout. The realization sent a ripple of something unfamiliar through her. Excitement, yes, but also something deeper. Possibility. She ran her fingers lightly over the glossy pages, imagining what she could do with the space, how she could breathe life into those sterile corporate lounges, bring something human, something beautiful into a world that too often valued only power and profit. It had been a long time since she let herself dream like this. Since Connor was born, her dreams had shrunk down to practicalities. Paying rent, keeping them safe, staying afloat. There hadn't been room for anything bigger. There hadn't been room for her. And now, Blair was offering her a chance, not just to design a space, but to step back into the version of herself she'd had to put aside. She closed the portfolio and leaned back, staring up at the cracked ceiling of her apartment. Could she really have both? A career that mattered and a life with Connor that stayed safe, stable? Could she trust Blair to mean what he said, to stay, to show up even when things got messy or complicated? Her heart warred with her mind, each battling for dominance. Old fears rose like smoke, promises broken, calls unanswered, cold hotel rooms filled with apologies that came too late. But new memories tugged at her too. Blair reading dinosaur books in the park. Blair burning pancakes with a crooked grin. Blair saying he was scared, but choosing to try anyway. Morgan pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the uneven beat of her heart. Maybe it didn't have to be all or nothing. Maybe she didn't have to choose between being strong and being vulnerable. Maybe trusting again didn't mean losing herself. Maybe it meant finding a different kind of strength, one rooted not in solitude, but in partnership. Her phone buzzed on the table. A simple text from Blair. Hope you're having a good night. Connor looks so happy today. Thank you for trusting me, even a little. Morgan stared at the screen, a lump forming in her throat. No pressure, no demands, just gratitude. She typed back, her fingers trembling slightly. One step at a time. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Outside the window, the city pulsed with endless motion, millions of stories unfolding at once. For the first time in years, Morgan allowed herself to imagine hers could be different, bigger, braver. Built not on fear, but on hope. A new dream, a life not just surviving, but thriving, with Connor at her side, and maybe, just maybe, with Blair too. The weeks passed quietly, stitched together by a rhythm Morgan had never dared hope for. Connor's laughter filled the corners of her apartment more often now, his world growing wider with each park visit, each story time, and each afternoon spent with Blair. And Morgan had watched him carefully in those first days, waiting for the cracks to show, for the inevitable retreat, but it never came. Instead, Blair showed up, consistently, for ice cream drips on summer sidewalks, for scraped knees and silly questions, for the small, ordinary moments that made up a life. Morgan sat now in the airy new office space Blair had helped her secure, not gifted her, not handed to her out of guilt, but rented to her at a fair rate after insisting she deserved a foundation she could build herself. She glanced around the room, sunlight pooling across the blank walls, the potential of it all making her heart race. A portfolio of new clients sat on her desk, referrals from Blair's connections, yes, but people she had impressed on her own merit. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was growing, flourishing. Her phone buzzed. Blair. Connor wants to show you his latest masterpiece. Prepare yourself. Morgan smiled, warmth flooding her chest. She gathered her things and locked up, stepping into the early evening air. When she arrived at Blair's penthouse, Connor was waiting by the door, a construction paper castle clutched proudly in his small hands. Blair knelt beside him, helping to steady the wobbly towers glued precariously together. Ta-da! Connor exclaimed, beaming. Morgan laughed, dropping to her knees to admire it properly. It's amazing, she said solemnly. Is this where the dinosaurs live? Connor nodded, pleased with himself. Blair's gaze met hers over their son's head, and something unspoken passed between them, a quiet pride, a tenderness neither of them could quite put into words. They spent the evening sprawled across the living room floor, building castles and battling imaginary dragons. Connor eventually collapsed in a tangle of pillows and soft snores, utterly spent. Morgan tucked a blanket over him and sat back, her heart full and aching at the same time. Blair moved to sit beside her, close but not crowding her. This feels good, he said quietly. Normal. Morgan nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. It did feel good. It felt right, not perfect, not without its scars, but real. The kind of life she hadn't dared to believe she could have when she packed up her tiny car and started over with a baby in her arms. Blair leaned back on his hands, staring up at the ceiling. I never thought I could have this, he said, not without losing everything else. You didn't lose, Morgan said softly. You just learned what matters. Blair turned his head, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. And you, he said, voice rough, you're what matters. Morgan's heart twisted painfully. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe in all of this. But trust wasn't given. It was built, brick by brick, moment by moment. And maybe, just maybe, they were finally learning how to build it together. She leaned against him lightly, allowing herself to rest there for just a moment. One small act of faith, one small piece of a future still unfolding, growing together. The chandeliers glittered like 1,000 stars above the grand ballroom, casting a golden glow across the sea of evening gowns and sharp tuxedos. Morgan adjusted the slim strap of her midnight blue gown, the satin fabric hugging her figure perfectly, and lifted her chin as she stepped inside with Blair. She wasn't just a guest tonight. She wasn't just Blair Burlington's date. She was Morgan Brown, CEO of her own rising interior design firm, and she belonged here. Blair caught her hand lightly, pride shining in his eyes as he leaned down and murmured, "You're stunning." Morgan smiled, her heart lifting. "And you," she teased back, smoothing his lapel, "are scandalously handsome for a CEO." Blair chuckled, squeezing her hand gently before leading her into the crowd. Around them, the city's elite mingled. Titans of industry, philanthropists, artists. Morgan recognized several faces from business profiles and magazine covers. Once, she might have felt small among them. Once, she might have worried about every glance, every whispered judgment. Not tonight. Tonight, she saw them for what they were. People. People who worked hard, dreamed bigger, failed, succeeded, started over. And she was one of them. As they crossed the room, more than a few heads turned, some toward Blair, of course, but others toward her. Her confidence was magnetic, her presence undeniable. A woman in an emerald dress approached, offering a warm smile. "You must be Morgan Brown," she said. "Blair's mentioned your firm. I hear you're doing incredible work." Morgan returned the smile easily, extending her hand. "Thank you. We just launched our latest project last week. It's been an amazing ride." As they chatted, Morgan felt Blair's quiet support at her side, not overshadowing, not steering, just being there, proud and present. Later, after introductions and congratulations, after champagne toasts and the low hum of a live orchestra, Blair led her out onto a terrace that overlooked the glittering city skyline. The night air was crisp, carrying the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Morgan leaned against the stone balustrade, soaking it all in. The life she had built, the life they were building together. Blair slid his arm around her waist, drawing her close. "I hope you know," he said quietly, "none of this would mean anything without you and Connor." Morgan turned, facing him fully. "And I hope you know," she said, her voice strong, "that I'm proud of you, Blair, not just for what you've built, but for who you've become." His eyes darkened with emotion. "And you?" he asked, brushing his knuckles against her cheek. "You're not just a part of my world, Morgan. You've built your own." Morgan smiled, fierce and bright. "I have," she said, "and I'm not afraid of stepping into yours anymore either." Blair kissed her then, slow and certain, and Morgan kissed him back with everything she had. No hesitations, no lingering doubts. This was their life, their future. They were no longer two broken pieces trying to fit. They were building something stronger, together. And when Blair whispered, "I want to move us into a villa, someplace quieter, with a real garden for Connor, a cook to fuss over you, a housekeeper so you can focus on your dreams," Morgan didn't flinch. She didn't push it away. She smiled, feeling the warmth of acceptance fill her chest. "I'd love that," she said simply. And she meant it, because love wasn't about holding back. It was about rising up to meet the life you had always deserved. Morgan sat across from Blair at the long oak table in the villa's sun-drenched kitchen. Sketches of her newest design projects spread between them. Gone were the cramped apartments and whispered fears. Here there was space for Connor to play, for dreams to grow, for a life bigger than either of them had dared hope for. Blair tapped a corner of the design with a smile. "You're not just growing a firm," he said. "You're setting a standard." Morgan laughed, feeling a buoyant kind of pride she didn't have to suppress. "I'm just getting started." And she was. Meetings with high-profile clients, magazine features, invitations to speak at industry events. Morgan wasn't surviving anymore. She was thriving. Harper Burlington sat on the villa's terrace, a cup of tea balanced gracefully between her fingers as she watched Morgan chase a squealing Connor across the lawn. When Morgan finally flopped down beside her, laughing, Harper smiled warmly. "You know," Harper said, "I worried once that Blair would never find someone strong enough to match him." Morgan caught her breath, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "And now?" she asked. Harper's smile deepened. "Now I think he found someone strong enough to challenge him, someone wise enough to love him without losing herself." Morgan blinked rapidly, moved more than she expected by the simple truth of it. Harper reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're not just fitting into this family, my dear. You're leading it." Morgan closed her hand over Harper's, feeling the certainty settle into her bones. She wasn't a guest in this life. She was home. Later that evening, Blair sat with Connor curled up against him in the villa's library, reading a worn dinosaur book for the third time. Morgan watched from the doorway, unnoticed, her heart swelling. Blair's voice was patient, soft, every page turned with care. When Connor drifted into sleep, Blair tucked him against his chest and whispered, "You are the best thing I never saw coming." Morgan stepped into the room and Blair looked up, his expression open, vulnerable. "You both are," he said quietly. Morgan walked over, pressing a kiss to Connor's forehead, then resting her hand lightly over Blair's. "We're here," she said simply, "and we're not going anywhere." The villa was no longer just a house. It was a home. Morgan stood barefoot in the open kitchen, surveying the cozy chaos around her. Connor's sneakers abandoned by the door, a vase of fresh flowers on the counter, Blair's laptop sitting beside a plate of half-eaten toast. Life. Messy, beautiful, everyday life. She padded into the sunroom where Blair sat reviewing reports, his glasses perched low on his nose, looking devastatingly human. "You work too much," she teased lightly, flopping down beside him. Blair chuckled, pulling her close. "I'm working for us now." Morgan smiled against his shoulder. She knew he meant it. Blair still ran Burlington Enterprises, but his priorities had shifted, and so had hers. Her design firm had just signed 3 new high-profile contracts. Her name was starting to be mentioned in magazines, not because she was Blair's fiancée, but because she had earned her place. She closed her eyes, feeling the hum of contentment settle deep inside her. This was what it meant to build a life. Together. On a soft Saturday morning, Morgan stood in the villa's back garden, watching Connor dig enthusiastically in the soil alongside the gardener, Miguel. Blair joined her, handing her a mug of coffee. "I was thinking," he said, watching Connor proudly show off a worm he had found, "we should plant a tree, something permanent." Morgan tilted her head. "A tree?" "Yeah," Blair said, nudging her playfully. "Something that grows with us." Morgan smiled, warmed by the thought. Later that afternoon, the three of them planted a young oak near the edge of the property. Morgan knelt beside Connor, helping him pat the earth down gently around the roots. Blair pressed a hand to her back, steady and sure. It wasn't just symbolic. It was a promise. They were no longer building temporary lives, waiting for the next crisis or disappointment. They were planting roots deep and strong, and they would weather whatever storms came. Together. Blair didn't need grand gestures anymore. One evening, after Connor had fallen asleep curled up with his favorite dinosaur blanket, Blair found Morgan standing out on the balcony, her hair loose around her shoulders. He slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "You know," he murmured against her ear, "when I first bought this place, I thought it would be a gift for you." Morgan turned to look at him, smiling. "It is," she said. "But not because it's big, because you made it home." Blair took a slow breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Morgan froze, her heart hammering. Opening the box, Blair revealed a simple, elegant ring, a smooth platinum band with a single diamond, not flashy, but breathtaking in its sincerity. "I don't want a perfect life," Blair said. "I want this messy, beautiful, real one. With you. With Connor." Morgan's eyes blurred with tears she didn't bother hiding. "Will you marry me?" he asked, voice low and steady. She laughed, the sound shaky but full of light. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course. Yes." Blair slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, long and deep, the kind of kiss that sealed promises no contract could ever hold. Their wedding was small but perfect, a gathering of the people who truly mattered. Connor served proudly as the ring bearer, his tiny suit slightly askew, but his grin wide and unstoppable. Morgan walked down the aisle in a soft, flowing gown. No tiara, no fuss, just joy, just certainty. Blair waited for her at the altar, his hands steady, his eyes shining with the weight of everything they had built. Their vows were simple. "I choose you," Morgan said. "Every day." "I choose you," Blair echoed, voice thick with emotion. "Forever." When he kissed her, the world around them melted away. They weren't healing the past, they were building the future. A family, a home, a love that was entirely, irrevocably theirs. Months later, Morgan stood at the front window of their villa, sipping tea and watching the sun rise over their garden. Connor's laughter floated in from outside, where he played tag with Blair and the new puppy Blair had surprised them with, a floppy golden retriever named Max. Morgan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Another client. Another opportunity. She smiled, sliding the phone into her pocket. Business could wait. Blair jogged up the steps, scooping Connor into his arms and grinning at her through the open doorway. Morgan set her cup down, walking toward them. This was the life she had chosen. Not out of fear, not out of necessity, out of hope, out of love. She pressed a kiss to Blair's cheek, ruffling Connor's hair as he giggled. Home, family, always and forever, exactly where she belonged.